Okay, I know more people will be coming, but perhaps we can get started with a little bit of an introduction as more people get on. So welcome everybody. We are pleased to have you here with us for the data collection webinar series that's organized by the Data and Analytics section at UNICEF headquarters. Today is the second webinar in Spring 2022 series. My name is Archana Dwavetti, and I work with the data collection unit here at UNICEF. Some of you may have been here 2 weeks ago when we covered data collection for the consensual approach to poverty. Some forthcoming webinars will include adolescent mental health, child food insecurity, and bullying, to name just a few. We will be covering topics that have recently gained relevance or importance and where there's ongoing work on how best to collect data. A few housekeeping rules before I turn it over. We have scheduled an hour and 15 minutes today, including Q&A. As always, throughout the webinar, please remain muted. Kindly write your questions in the chat box, and we will try to group your questions and direct them to the presenter during the Q&A period. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our SharePoint site here at UNICEF. It will also be there with all the past webinars, which you can easily gain access to. We will also post the recordings onto the Mix YouTube channel, which are publicly available. You can find the links to both of these in the email that you have received. And now I'm going to give the floor to Attila Hansioglu, Chief of the Data Collection Unit at UNICEF headquarters. Attila, over to you.
Thank you very much, Archana. Hello, everyone. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today's webinar is entitled Surveying Children and Their Caregivers about Access to ICTs, Opportunities and Risks in the Digital Environment. And we are very happy to have with us today Daniel Kardefelt-Winther, who is a research manager of Children and Digital Technology over at UNICEF Office of Research in Innocenti in Florence. Daniel leads UNICEF's research program on children and digital technologies at Innocenti. He has several years of experience in designing, implementing, and managing cross-national comparative evidence generation projects involving children and adults. In his current role, Daniel manages the Global Kids Online and Disrupting Harm projects, generating evidence with children in more than 30 low middle income countries. Daniel holds undergraduate degrees in computer science and psychology from Stockholm University, as well as a master's degree in management and a PhD in media and communications from the LSE London School of Economics, and holds a postdoctoral research position in the Department of Clinical Neuroscience at the Karolinska Institute. Daniel's presentation will include survey data collection related to children's experiences in accessing ICTs, opportunities and risks online. It will cover common challenges in conducting survey research with children and their caregivers, including safeguarding and talking to children about digital technology and sensitive topics like online sexual exploitation and abuse. And the presentation will provide some lessons learned from conducting household survey research in a post-pandemic setting following the COVID-19 related lockdowns. Daniel, the floor is yours. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Attila. Thanks, Archana, for having me. Very happy to be here. I cannot see the presentation on screen right now, but I suppose you'll try to get that up as I go.
Sorry, let's just fix that right now. I apologize. I don't know what I clicked on.
I think it's probably the way you're sharing the screen.
Yeah, sorry. Do you see anything at this point?
It is coming.
No, but it might be, yeah, it might be coming up.
Hold on. I think something has happened. So let me just close this. Apologies. Just one more second.
There we go. No, but now it went away again. Yeah, there you have it. So I'll begin. Thanks, Attila, again for the introduction. Just before I start, just to say that what me and my team does at the Office of Research, we focus primarily on data collection with children and families, and mainly through survey research. And it's those experiences, what we have learned from many years of doing this work, that I want to speak about today, hoping that it can provide some useful guidance for those thinking of undertaking similar work. I'll speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then leave the rest of the hour for questions, should there be any. Feel free to pop questions in the chat. As I go, I'll try to keep track of that. If you move to the first slide, please. I just wanted to begin by outlining the work that we've done from the Office of Research over the past years, focusing on children's access to and use of technologies, just so that you know a bit more about what my background, our background looks like, and what experiences we have at the Office of Research. But also because it serves as an introduction to some of the most widely used data collection instruments to study children's engagement with ICTs. So as Attila mentioned, over the past 6 or 7 years, we've directly led or supported more than 30 national studies on children's use of digital technology. We started this work because we needed to understand more as an organization about how children's lives were influenced by digital transformation, both in terms of what they experience in the digital environment itself, but also how their lives might be influenced more broadly as a result of digitalization, and what this means for different functions or institutions in society that children come into contact with. Education is an example. What does it mean for children if teaching and learning moves from a classroom setting to a digital environment? What does it mean for their education, the way it's delivered? What does it mean for data protection, their social engagement, much of which usually comes from spending time with other children in schools? Or what does it mean for children if crimes are committed against them in the digital environment, but the national legislation or the law enforcement actors, they're not sufficiently up to date to actually prosecute for it because part of this crime happened online? Sexual exploitation and abuse of children that is facilitated through technology is one example where national legislation, for example, is sometimes a bit behind the curve. And people don't really recognize that this is an issue when it happens digitally rather than physically. What does that mean? How do we understand those impacts on children? And so in our work, we focus not only on what happens in the digital environment, but also how those experiences interact with the broader systems and institutions meant to serve children. That is what we try to get at with our data collection. A particularly important motivation back when we started was to advance this kind of research in non-Western settings. Most of Europe already had substantial high-quality evidence on children's experiences in a digital environment since around 2010. It was similar in the United States, Australia, etc., but we knew very, very little about the situation in many of the countries where UNICEF works, especially low and middle income settings. And that meant that we couldn't advise the government as well as we wanted to on how to protect and support children in a digital environment and prepare these national systems for digital transformation. So what have we done so far? Well, the first thing we did back in 2015 was that we founded the Global Kids Online project. And this is primarily a household survey project that we co-founded with the London School of Economics and the EU Kids Online Network. The purpose is providing a methodology to survey children aged 9 to 17 usually, and one of their parents, on many different aspects that are relevant to understand the impact of digital transformation on children's lives. We survey children on their access to and use of the internet. We want to know what devices they have access to, what their digital skills look like, the different activities they engage in online, the risks they encounter, and how parents and teachers and important others around them engage with them around their use of technologies. And the Global Kids Online project is basically designed to provide a broad picture of children's access to and engagement with the internet in any given country. Almost all of those surveys are nationally representative that we have done, and they typically use multi-stage cluster sampling within clusters. So we try to aim for a pretty good quality in terms of the sampling and the data we collect. The survey questionnaire provided by Global Kids Online itself is built on really excellent work done by the EU Kids Online Network, who really pioneered cross-national research on children's internet use in Europe. They did this work in 28 European countries following a strong push by the European Commission. And this was really the first large-scale comparative study on this topic that was ever done. And our goal was to build on their research and their methodology and adapt it for use in low and middle income settings or non-Western settings, where the questions asked and the approaches taken sometimes need to be a little bit different. We've done that quite successfully, I would say, and between 2015 and today, the Global Kids Online Questionnaire has been used in survey research in around 20 countries outside of Europe that we know of and have actively supported and guided. It's openly available, so anyone could technically use it. And the Global Kids Online Questionnaire was in turn picked up on, further improved and used again by the EU Kids Online Network in their latest round of European household surveys in 2019 in another 19 countries. So all in all, this particular questionnaire that we've been working with and developed over the past couple of years has been used in around 40 countries around the world, which makes it, at least to my knowledge, the most widely used questionnaire to study children's internet use at a national level. Building in part on that work, we also have our Disrupting Harm project, which we co-lead together with ECPAT International and Interpol. This project is very much a mixed methods project, but our focus from Innocenti's side has been on conducting household surveys with children and families. This project basically implements a Global Kids Online survey, but one that has been extensively modified to focus on technology-facilitated sexual abuse of children. And this is a very thorny topic where there hasn't traditionally been that much survey research done, other than some from the United States and select countries in Europe. And so for this work, we had to design and trial and test new ways to ask children about very sensitive, very private experiences in a survey format, which was actually quite challenging. And these questionnaires from the Disrupting Harm survey, they were implemented in 13 countries in 2021. We're analyzing and writing that work up now. But the nice thing about that project is that it retained key questions from the Global Kids Online survey for comparability purposes, which means that right now we actually have comparable data from almost 50 countries around the world that UNICEF and our many partners that we work with have generated, which is really not bad over the course of 7 years. Some of this data is at this point somewhat outdated, I would say, especially since digital development moves quickly. But even so, it has provided a pretty good starting point for making some evidence-informed decisions about policies and programs affecting children and the use of ICTs. And that kind of sums up our portfolio work as far as household survey research goes, just so that you can understand a bit better where we're coming from and what kind of experiences we have. Could you move to the next slide, please? So moving on, I wanted to take you through some of the basics of conducting household surveys with children and families on their use of ICTs, internet digital technologies. And this summarizes really many of the things we've learned by working on our own implementations, as well as together with the many UNICEF country offices that have implemented this work together with us. The first thing I wanted to talk about are kind of the practicalities around conducting this kind of research. What's really needed in terms of financial resources, expertise, or tools. One question I get a lot is how much it costs to do this kind of a survey. The answer is always somewhat unsatisfactory, which is that it depends. It depends on whether you contract a local university, for example, to do the work for you, using students as data collectors, or whether you hire a professional survey agency that does this kind of work all the time for lots of clients. Working with a university tends to be cheaper, but usually results in a lot more management time for you. And conversely, working with an agency is more expensive, but tends to be quite easy. For both of these approaches, you do need a certain amount of oversight to ensure that the work is well done. And that kind of expertise can be provided, for example, by expert consultants that you hire. It's pretty common. Generally, I would say that data collection for this kind of national study that we have experience running tends to cost anywhere between $40,000 to $100,000. And the cost really varies depending on local capacity, salaries, geographic complexity of the country, and a range of other factors. I think in terms of expertise, it is really advisable to work with a consultant or a research team that understands this topic really well and can make the right methodological and conceptual decisions. And the conceptual part is really important because a lot of people carry a lot of prejudices about children's engagement with the internet. It's very easy to end up asking children about their internet use from kind of an adult perspective, which doesn't always yield the best results. As adults, I think we're often a bit mistaken in our understanding of what children do online, how it affects them, and so on, which can lead us to ask the wrong questions or misinterpret or misrepresent data. Part of this problem can be alleviated by using existing tools. As I mentioned earlier, our Global Kids Online and Disrupting Harm methodologies, they've been widely used and shown to work quite well for serving children. They've been designed and adapted together with children to put a child's perspectives, experiences, and feelings first. And the Global Kids Online key measures, they were recently officially adopted by the ITU expert group on household indicators, the subgroup for child online protection, as a recommended standard for countries serving children on this issue. So those tools can act as a good starting point and be further adapted at national level as needed. In terms of the data itself that's generated by these kinds of survey projects or other survey projects with children, I think it's important to consider what the data should and should not be used for, or rather how to use it and present it. Our approach generally has been to take the data very much for what it is. It's self-reported information from children, some of whom surely did not want to sit there and fill out our survey, others who were distracted by friends running around or bothered by their parents sitting nearby trying to peek at their answers. In short, we believe these data that we get from these kind of surveys to be good approximations of what children in the country are experiencing. But we tend to not really go into presenting highly detailed and precise point estimates, presenting results down to 2-3 decimals and treat the data as an absolute truth in a way. We don't typically consider very small age or gender differences as particularly relevant. We present the data carefully, but we remind ourselves that it's self-report data from children, sometimes very young children. And so it's important not to treat it with respect, but not exaggerate its preciseness or accuracy. I personally don't think that makes it less valuable in any way, because the phenomena we're studying are social phenomena, that they're not such that it matters a great deal what the exact point estimate shows. It's more the general pattern or tendency that we care about. For example, we see in almost all countries where we work that children tend to use ICTs primarily to socialize with others, search for information, or do homework. They tend to be the top 3. It doesn't matter so much if it's 60% or 65% of children who use the internet to do homework. The important takeaway is really that a large proportion of children do it. So in my view, when working with this kind of data, we should focus less on the exact percentage points and rather use this data to help us observe overall patterns. If we do complex analysis, that's of course a different story, but this kind of data, in my experience, lends itself particularly well to presenting useful descriptive analysis. The survey questionnaires that we most often work with have been designed to inform advocacy, policy, or programs. In that respect, they're quite well suited to UNICEF's work. And over time, we've scaled back questions that were more of academic interest and really tried to tailor the questionnaires to be useful for advocacy, for policy. And we achieve this by aligning our questionnaire at design stage with the national agenda and national priorities to ensure that we ask questions that are useful to the country. Much of our data has been used to inform awareness-raising campaigns, and more recently to inform design of specific programs or to target implementation. So what are some of the general do's and don'ts as people conduct household surveys on this topic? I'll mention three. I think a very common issue that was prevalent for a long time, which I already touched on a bit, was that researchers would take a very kind of adult lens in questionnaire design. Lots of survey research with children on this topic asks questions that adults think are important to children, but where children themselves have either moved past this particular topic already, or it's just not so consequential for their lives, or at least of minor importance compared to other things. So in my view, it's really important to make sure that the things that you ask about in your survey research are really relevant to children. Otherwise, the research will not be effective, and recommendations will not be taken up, or even worse, taken up, implemented, and do nothing. I think related to that, and now we're getting into some of the more topic-specific issues, we shouldn't assume that adults and children share the same experiences with technology. And I think a good example here is research on children's internet access or digital inclusion. There are many studies that have tried to estimate access for children by extrapolating from indicators for parents or from households. So as an example, it's not uncommon to use measures of fixed internet access in the home, like a cable connection, existing or not, as a proxy for a child having access to the internet. Or it's sometimes assumed that if we survey parents on their access to the internet, we will automatically have a reliable statistic also for children. But what we've learned through our research with families is that parents and children's access to the internet can be very different. Parents may have access, but there is no guarantee that they will allow their child to use the internet because it's expensive, or it's seen as dangerous, or this is just not something that they think children should be doing at all. These kinds of barriers can affect boys and girls differently as well. And even if the child can access the internet, they may not be allowed to use it as much as they want to or need to in order to actually benefit from it. Or they can only use it under strict supervision or with limitations. So using parents' access as a proxy has some challenges. And further complicating this issue is that in some countries, parents, particularly older parents, actually use the internet much less than their children. So by relying on estimates of adult access to understand what children are accessing or not, we risk underestimating also the access that children in some countries have. And all of this is really important to consider when trying to understand how children in a particular country are or are not able to access the internet and the kind of barriers they face in doing so. We have some new research on this from Africa and Asia that will be released soon that can hopefully be informative. And the last thing that I feel quite strongly about, and I think a lot of people on this webinar probably do, is that if you're going to survey children on their use of ICTs, or really anything at all, you need to do it well. Invest properly in the study. Make sure the sampling design is good, or at least know its limitations. Use a questionnaire that is of high quality. Conduct proper pilots. Treat the data in your analysis with care. Sense check your results with children or other stakeholders. The reason I raise this is because in this particular field of children and ICTs, there's been far too much survey research with children done on this topic in the past decade that is just not of very high quality, more on some topics than others. But it has diluted the evidence base and confused policymakers, parents, and practitioners a great deal. Next slide, please. So I thought I would now run through some of the challenges that you might encounter when conducting household survey research with children and families on their use of ICTs. And I also want to suggest some solutions to those where we have them. The first challenge that came up a lot in the beginning of our work was that it's not always clear to respondents, to people, what exactly we mean by ICTs or internet or digital technologies. When we ran our first survey pilots, very frequently enumerators would go and knock on a door. They would ask a parent or a caregiver if they had children in the household who used the internet so that we could interview them. And the parent would say, no, there are no children who use the internet. And then the enumerator would probe a bit. They would ask some questions about the children in the household and what they like to do. And eventually the parent would say, oh, my child is just on Facebook all the time. So we learned quite quickly that words like internet, digital technology, even something like mobile phones, does not always translate very well. And in many countries, people refer rather to the specific app or the website they use, not the technology itself. And this required us to change our strategy when approaching households to communicate what our study was about. But it also forced us to change things in the actual questionnaire, to give lots of examples of what we mean when we refer to the internet or mobile phones. And this is something that really took us by surprise when we first started doing this work. A second challenge is that countries are generally very uneven in terms of their use of ICTs or ICT diffusion. And this means that if you sample the general population for your study, in some countries, you will not identify many internet users at all. And so you wouldn't, for example, be able to do more complex analysis, or you might end up with just far too few internet users to conclude anything meaningful. We usually use a targeted approach where we include a household in the survey if the child living in that household has used the internet in the past 3 months. And that's based on an ITU definition of what counts as an internet user. The downside of that is that your data is not always representative of children, of all children in the country, only of internet using children in the country. Sometimes those are mostly equivalent populations in high connectivity settings, for example, but in some countries there's a huge difference. But because we have primarily been interested in how children use the internet rather than if they use the internet, we have had to prioritize obtaining a large enough sample of internet using children to be able to draw reliable conclusions. If your main question was around digital access and inclusion, for example, you would probably use a different approach. You would probably target the general population. And that's something to think about carefully when designing your research. Another challenge that I also touched briefly upon before is that traditionally there has been a heavy focus on research in Western contexts, which meant that concepts and language that we use to describe different aspects of children's internet use, they just didn't communicate very well. And this is something that needs to be dealt with on a country-by-country basis, depending on how local languages have adapted to digital transformation. And if children use local terms, international English terms, or a mix of both, or something completely new, to refer to different aspects of their internet use. We usually deal with this challenge by having workshops where the questionnaire is queried by locals before piloted. It can be done by enumerators during training, for example, to get a better sense if the words that we use in the questionnaire will actually make sense to children. It kind of adds another dimension to the issue of translation, because it's not simply a matter of translating one word to another. It's about actually understanding what word children use to refer to a particular phenomena related to their use of ICT. And they can be entirely new, entirely made up, and unknown to big parts of the older population. But it's really important to find out how children talk about these issues. Next. Related to that, it's an issue of conveying what you mean to children in your survey, which is a challenge for any kind of survey research involving children, not just on ICTs. But because the digital environment is new and it can be quite complex in its functioning, it's sometimes not very easy to convey to children what we mean, or actually even for us to understand what it is that we are trying to convey. I remember we struggled quite a lot when we tried to ask children, for example, what kind of data plans they were using to access the internet. We wanted to know if that somehow was related to disparities in internet access. We asked them whether it was a prepaid SIM card, postpaid SIM card, if they top up the SIM card after each use, if they bought different data packages, and so on. And trying to convey those kind of intricacies to children in a survey was really difficult for us at the time. And we eventually had to give up because we just couldn't wrap our head around this. And we kind of didn't know what we were actually asking because these data plans also differ by country. And we had similar challenges in our research on online sexual exploitation and abuse, where it was notably difficult to try to ask children about their experiences of sexual violence and try to obtain information on how technology was used to facilitate that violence, which can happen in a lot of different ways that are very difficult to describe. I don't have great solutions for this one, other than try to ask simpler questions and use pilot and cognitive interviews extensively when developing the questionnaire, and just be highly self-critical. This has been a real challenge for us. I think it's also important to recognize, moving in a slightly different direction, that some topics that we ask about, especially with respect to online risks and harms, they're really sensitive. We've done quite a bit of work trying to figure out what works best for children, both in terms of making them feel comfortable and for enabling them to provide accurate answers. One challenge we always face when doing the actual field work is that parents are quite keen to look at what children respond, or at least try to overhear the oral part of the survey interview. This is not good when asking children about sensitive questions. And we don't want to put the child in a situation where they feel forced to answer because an enumerator is sitting there expecting it, and at the same time, the parent is standing there wanting to know the answer. We found two things that work quite well in terms of providing children with sufficient privacy to respond to our questionnaires, which I think could be applied to survey research with children in general. The first is that we also survey the parent on comparable questions. It's one of the strengths of our method. This is really valuable because it's super interesting to compare parents' results with those of their children, for example. But it has the added advantage that it keeps the parent occupied. If they're occupied, they're less likely to try to overhear or oversee what the child is doing. The second thing we do is that we simply have a hard rule that we enforce. We train all enumerators on this, that if the parent isn't giving the child enough privacy to respond, you terminate the interview. This helps convey to the parent that we're really serious about the child being able to respond in private. But it also helps ensure that a child doesn't get into trouble for answering any of the questions we ask. And we actually track this during fieldwork, whether a parent was standing too close, trying to overhear, trying to listen. So we can actually analyze if these kind of things make a difference in terms of the responses children give. One issue with this is that it's also not unreasonable for a parent to want some oversight over their child when a random stranger is in their house with them. I think we can all understand that. So we train the enumerator to try to find a space where the parent can see the child, but not overhear them and not oversee their answers. Sometimes this means doing the survey outdoors, which we've actually had a lot of success with. But really, because we almost always prefer enumerators to work in pairs of two, usually the second enumerator can survey the parent at the same time, or otherwise just find good ways to distract them. And that's something that we also try to encourage. On enumerators, in addition to there being two of them, we actually found a lot of success in working with enumerators that are closer to the children's age. So most of them would be young adults, most of the enumerators we work with. We find that this can really help keep children's attention. Children seem to be a bit more engaged, a bit more interested, and young enumerators can sometimes find it easier to convey the meaning of some of the questions that we ask, or they will be more in tune with the language that the child would use to describe something. So this is something that I can highly recommend. This concludes the challenges part, although I haven't spoken comprehensively to the topic of child safeguarding, although I've touched on different things relevant for safeguarding throughout. The reason I decided not to go comprehensively into this is that it would take up a whole webinar to do that well. And also because some of it pertains to survey research in general, not specific to ICTs. But suffice it to say that child safeguarding is absolutely essential for this kind of work. It's part of conducting a thorough ethical review process, which I would recommend is done at a national level with national ethic review boards for each country where a survey is done. There are good publicly available resources on how to do the safeguarding part well within the context of research. A good starting point for that would be guidance from the ERIC project, or Ethical Research Involving Children. And I will put a link to that in the chat later on. I will speak a little bit more about aspects of safeguarding for the last part of this webinar, though, where I'm going to talk a bit about how we conducted household survey research in a post-pandemic setting, which was quite an experience. But I just want to flag that it's not comprehensive. It's not a comprehensive overview of child safeguarding. I'm happy to respond to questions on that separately to the best of my ability, but there is potentially a lot to cover there that is really important. And final slide, please. So in our recent multi-country survey project on online child sexual exploitation and abuse, the data collection part, the fieldwork, took place just following the COVID-19 pandemic. We did it in 13 different countries in Africa and Asia. We were observing regulation from governments and the spread of the pandemic in each country, and by working closely with local organizations, we were able to start up fieldwork in each country as the governments relaxed quarantine and movement restrictions, indicating that COVID was somewhat under control. But that did not mean we could operate quite as normal. One of the first things we realized was that because of the lockdown, there were issues with child protection services at national level, to which we would need to report cases of child abuse or maltreatment that we witnessed during fieldwork, or where potentially our respondents would call because something triggered a negative psychological response that they wanted help or support with. Many of these services, as I'm sure many of you know, they were not really functional during or just after the pandemic. They didn't respond to requests as normal due to being heavily overburdened with additional work or not having all of their staff on site. But having these services ready and responsive is really critical in case you need to activate your reporting protocol. So for each country, before we started fieldwork, we did a rapid assessment of whether there were functioning child protection services or organizations that could receive reports of suspected or actual child abuse or neglect or maltreatment, to determine if it was ethical for us to proceed. If these services are not available, it really wouldn't be good practice to start up any kind of fieldwork. So once we had determined that there were actually functioning child protection services in the country, the next challenge we ran into was, how do we make sure that our enumerators are not getting infected with COVID, and how to minimize the risk that they then would spread it further as they walk from house to house. That was still in a post-pandemic setting, very much a risk. We did a couple of things here that worked really well for us. The first was that we decided to conduct all surveys outdoors as a matter of general practice and as far as possible. Worked surprisingly well in many countries. We also provided all enumerators with full protective equipment, including lots of disinfectants that they could use to wipe down tablets, pens, any equipment that they or any respondent would touch. And they were instructed to do this after finishing each household visit, and also before actually going into a household to reassure the household that they were properly taking care of disinfecting all of the equipment. All respondents that were asked to, if they wanted to take part in the survey, they were also asked if they or someone they knew had been infected with COVID recently. If anyone in that household said yes, we would not continue with the survey. All enumerators we worked with, they took regular COVID tests every day to ensure that they were fit to work. And at the end of the study, all in all, we had a total of 2 COVID scares where enumerators had come into contact with someone that might have been exposed, but not a single enumerator out of the more than 150, maybe 200 working on this project, none of them got COVID as a result of the fieldwork, which is good. And we also did not hear of any respondent getting COVID following our fieldwork, even when inquiring about this at later stages as part of the normal quality control and follow-up with selected households. part of this effort, we also had to monitor the spread of COVID within each country very carefully to plan fieldwork each day, to make sure we weren't going into areas that had a high caseload, that had an outbreak, or were somehow under separate government restrictions. In some countries, in most countries actually, this incurred a little bit of extra cost due to the fieldwork being constantly rescheduled or moved. This was particularly the case in countries where free movement across regions was not allowed, or where there were certain restrictions when you crossed regional borders. There were cases where we had to send enumerators to other regions, then we had to put them up in quarantine hotels. So they could quarantine there for a week, sometimes 2 weeks, before they were allowed out and could resume fieldwork. This was all a bit expensive, but in the end, it worked out. I think it was well worth it to minimize the risk of spreading COVID to respondents or putting the enumerators at further risk. And obviously, I hope that these COVID-related challenges that I've talked about are not going to be very common in the future. But some of the practices, some of the solutions we came up with may still be informative in the coming years if COVID does not go away, or if we have a different pandemic. And so I thought I would share that as well, because it was quite a different experience for us. And that really concludes my presentation. But I'm of course happy to take questions. I can see there are a number of them in the chat. I don't know, Archana, if I should just go ahead and respond to them, or if we do it in some structured way. But just to say, I'm very happy to also do any other follow-up over email as needed.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. That was a great presentation. Very much about the data collection aspect of it, which is what these webinars are about. So thank you so much. As you saw already, there's a number of questions in the chat box and the comments, and maybe I can help you to save you time from reading them, to direct them to you. The first question is, you partly answered it in passing, is whether the Global Kids Online survey tools are openly available and accessible publicly, and if there are any conditions for their adaptation. Maybe I can further the question a little bit and say what exactly is available, not only questionnaires, but methodologies, sampling, those kinds of things. Are they available, and how accessible are they?
It's a very good question. Thanks, Aislu. Thanks, Attila, also for adding to it. They're openly available, and I'm going to put, we have a website in the chat. We have a website that I'm linking in the chat. Here you can see on the tools page, you can see both qualitative and quantitative tools. What you get from that is, it's like a menu of options, is the best way to describe it. It's basically all of the questions that we've trialed in different countries and found to work quite well. They cover lots of different aspects of children's engagement with ICTs. I would not recommend anyone to use all of those questions. It's far too much. But it's a menu of options from which you can pick and choose and figure out how can we adapt this to our national context? How could this work for us? It's more, it gives you ideas and ways of asking children these questions. So they're fully available and they're on the website. In terms of methods, we have a set of methods guides. I'm going to put that link in the chat as well, which was developed by, it's 11 guides. They were developed by international experts on this topic together with our office, and they cover different dimensions of what you need to know when engaging in this kind of research. It includes survey sampling and administration. It includes adopting and adapting the survey to your context. It involves how you address diversities and inequalities, for example. So, and the ethics also, the ethics dimension is also covered. Say that at this point, they might be a little bit outdated. I'm not sure they fully reflect all of the learnings we've had over the past few years. They were produced in 2016. But I think as a basic resource, that is actually quite useful. And also to just get back on the final question, there are no conditions for the adaptation of the Global Kids Online survey. You're free to take it and use it as you wish. We usually support when we work with partners. We can support on the adaptation. We have quite a lot of experience in doing that, but there are no formal requirements as such. We would love to know if you want to use the questionnaire because it helps us keep track of where it's being used. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Another question is about the freedom that children should be given access to ICT. And the final question there in the comment is whether UNICEF can develop some ethical protocols regarding the children's access to technology.
Yeah, so this is a big question, and I'm not sure I can answer this in a fully satisfactory way. I think restricting access to technology for children has simply too many drawbacks to be an ethical option. We've seen in research that we and others have done that if you restrict access, you can manage to reduce, for example, some risks that they encounter, but you also reduce their skills, you reduce the opportunities they have. And so what we recommend generally is to go for a more balanced approach, where instead of restricting access, a parent actively engages and supports, find ways to learn more about the internet themselves so they can guide their children, kind of be part of their journey. Because when parents restrict access, children become very reluctant to go to them and seek help when something goes wrong. They start lying about when they are online and when they're not. And in general, this doesn't really lead to the kind of trusting relationship that we would hope that a child would have with their parent if they feel they have to sneak around because otherwise they're worried that internet access will be taken away from them. We actually saw this in our research on online child sexual exploitation and abuse, that one of the reasons why children don't report when they experience sexual abuse online is because they're afraid that their parents will take away the device or restrict their access. And then they have to, carry the burden of this crime alone just because they didn't feel they could trust their parent with these things. So it's a very complicated issue. But generally, I think restrictions are not really the way to go.
Yeah, especially going forward with when this is becoming very prevalent, of course. There's a question not to you, Daniel, but to the mix team on whether there are any plans to consider ICT for children as a module or in mix going forward. And the simple answer is yes. The 7th round of mix starts next year, and the mix team is seriously considering to include this as a standard tool in the mix surveys. A question about requirements for interviewers to get tested for COVID before they start the survey. Was this was this vaccination status a consideration in their recruitment?
Yes, it was. It was, and ethical concerns were. There were, of course, a lot of ethical concerns. I spoke about this very briefly, but we had so much back and forth with our, the senior advisor for ethics and evidence generation at the Office of Research about this. We went back and forth for a long time, trying to understand how we could do this in an ethical way, not just with respect to requiring interviewers to get tested, but with the whole approach and the kind of risks that came with it. So yeah, there were ethical concerns. We felt, and our ethics advisor felt, we had sufficiently good protocols to proceed, but it was far from simple.
Thanks, Daniel. Another question, a practical question, it says, would you say it is more effective to conduct a survey during school year or during summer break? And of course, there would be two aspects to this question. One is to be able to access the children and interview them during those seasons, let's call them seasons. And the other is the actual access of children to ICTs and their experience during school year or during summer break, which could be. So is there seasonality in the data that you would get?
Yeah, they're excellent points, and I really, really appreciate what you're saying there, Atla. You're absolutely right, because it is very possible that there are seasonal variations. We actually haven't analyzed this in great depth because we could do that if we had, I think, data from the same country from different seasons. But because we mostly do, unfortunately, one-off cross-sectional surveys in one country at a time, We could still look at seasonality, I suppose, but I'm not sure if there are other things at a country level that would kind of distort the picture. It's an interesting question, actually. We haven't looked into that. In terms of accessing the children, it can hit both ways, I would say. During the school, when they're in school, you would need to, for example, work much later in the day. When they come home from school, many children have to do chores, so you would have a very limited kind of time window, which can make it a little bit trickier. The advantage is that you can sort of more rely on them being actually in the household at a certain point during the day, unless they're in boarding schools, which actually we have come up against, which could completely distort your sampling. If they're in boarding schools, you run into different issues, because then you won't get children in boarding schools through your household survey, and that raises all sorts of questions with respect to bias. If you try to get them during your summer break, then one thing we have found in some countries, we try not to do it, but what we found is that children are not always around. It can actually be harder to find them because they or their families are somewhere else. This I can only speak from very few countries. I don't know if that would be an issue in many other countries, but we try to do during the school year for that reason. The advantage with summer break, if you can identify the children, is that they might have a bit more time to engage. So that could be a good thing. I think it depends very much on which country you're working in.
Thanks, Daniel. Dario is saying that they're about to conduct a kids online survey and asking about the overlap between the kids online and disrupting harm. Is there any overlap, and is it worth conduct disrupting harm when there's a recent kids online survey?
That is an excellent question, Dario. I'm really glad you're raising it, and I know the colleagues in Uruguay who are going to, I think, implement the kids online survey with you. There is overlap. There is considerable overlap, but it largely depends on how you design the survey. Because what Global Kids Online does not include as a default are questions on online child sexual exploitation and abuse, which is probably the topic that, at least for UNICEF offices, is the highest on the child online protection agenda in our organization. Global Kids Online misses out on that. It captures general risks like cyberbullying, encountering hate speech, seeing sexual images, and so on. There is overlap with respect to how children access the internet, the devices they use, the digital skills they have, the opportunities they engage in. But it is really what you miss out on is the sexual exploitation and abuse element. So if that is of particular interest to you, I would suggest that you work with the partners who are implementing the Kids Online survey and see if you can take the Disrupting Harm module for some instances of sexual exploitation and abuse and include it. And we can work with them to make sure that that happens if you wish. Otherwise, I would probably not conduct the Disrupting Harm survey if there is a recent Kids Online survey. But I also want to be clear that Disrupting Harm is much, much broader as a project than just a survey. It's 7 research projects in one. The survey is only one of those. It's a mixed methods project that draws on data from lots of different data sources. So Disrupting Harm is a little bit different in that respect. But for the survey itself, I would not overlap them. I don't think it's worth it. Rather, take Disrupting Harm questions, include it in the Global Kids Online questionnaire. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to reach out if you want to discuss this further.
Thanks, Daniel. A question about age groups interviewed and whether you actually have different questions for different age groups of children. Do you ask questions differently if you can cover different when you cover if you cover different topics for different age groups actually? And further, maybe to add again, can you say something about the variability in the sample sizes in different countries?
Okay, so the first question on age groups. Some countries prefer to do this, other countries do not. For the Global Kids Online questionnaire, we don't have, as a general rule, different questions for different age groups. We try to make sure that they can be asked of all children between 9 and 17. In disrupting harm, because of the very sensitive nature of those questions, there are some questions on sexual abuse that we only asked of the older children. I'm of two minds whether that's a good idea or not. It always kind of annoys me when you can't speak for the full group of children that you've targeted in the rest of the survey. It also complicates statistical modeling sometimes if you want to include all children. So I guess the answer is no, we don't really try to do that. Possibly we should. But when we try, I'm never really satisfied with the results. That could just be because we're not doing it right. Variability. So this is an interesting one. And I will try to respond to your question, Attila, as well as I can. There tends to be, because we sample in most of our studies, we sample internet using children. And there tends to be more older children than younger children who use the internet, which introduces a skew in our sample. But it also, we think, reflects what is actually going on in the country, which is that more older children use the internet than younger ones. This is a little bit complicated when we come to the analysis stage, because of the variability of within each age group. I don't know if there's anything specific you're thinking about when you're asking this question, but just to say there is variability, and it is because of a result of how internet access tends to spread across different age groups. This is a complicated situation for us quite often.
Yeah, just question was about if you have huge variations in terms of the numbers of interviewers.
It's not huge. It's not huge. It tends to be fairly even, but there is a skew towards, it's more older children. Yeah.
Maybe to go into a little bit more specifics, you filter out, or you do a screening at the door before you actually go into the households and interview children. But during the screening, do you also get an estimate of the number of children in the household and the household size as well?
Yes, we do. So this is what in Global Kids Online surveys, we didn't do that in the past, and it was a problem. And so for the later surveys that we've done, we actually screen exactly as you say. We check the number of children in the household. We get their age and gender. We get whether they use the internet or not. It's not always the case that every child in the household can access the internet. So we have that information as well. And then we randomly select one child that fits within our criteria to actually do the interview.
Thanks. You mentioned that there's a difference. There would be a difference in the data that you would get if you were getting adults' perspectives as opposed to children's perspectives or data. But just to be a devil's advocate, would there be also certain elements of this type of data that would be better quality if they were coming from the adults as opposed to the children?
That's a really good question. There are certainly, so to be clear, we do survey one child and one caregiver per household. So we do get data from both. If it's about understanding children's experiences, I think, I would love to be challenged on this one, but I think most probably the best quality data comes from the child in most cases I can think of. But there are some cases where having information from adults is extremely valuable as well, because you can actually compare the answers. So you can ask a child, how much does your parent support you when you use the internet? And they will say, not at all. And you ask the same question of the parent, and they will say, oh, I support all the time. And through that, you can identify, okay, there's a disconnect here. How do we bridge that? But I think in terms of understanding the specifics of children's experiences, I think it's almost always more useful to ask the child. I would love to be challenged on that one. If someone can come up with an idea, it would help us to create better surveys. That's my spontaneous answer. It's a good one. I will think more about that.
Thanks, Daniel. One final question, or maybe we have a few more minutes for questions. How about doing these surveys or asking these questions in a CATI environment with telephone interviewing, which
Excellent
as you know, has become very, very popular, especially during COVID and the post-COVID times.
Excellent question. I think for Global Kids Online, it can be done. It has been done actually in 2 or 3 countries that I can think of. There are some downsides which relate to the length of the interview. I think generally you would end up with a shorter survey if you do it on telephone interview, though again, Attila, maybe you have different experiences, but I would think it's a bit shorter. I think you run into some challenges with respect to the type of sensitive questions that you can ask. I think I probably wouldn't recommend asking very sensitive questions about online harms, exploitation, abuse in a CATI interview, because you cannot really see how the child is reacting in the same way and how they feel about it. It's also more difficult to know if the parent is sort of listening in, overhearing, if they have a fully private environment. Consent and assent procedures can probably be managed, but it's a little bit more complicated, I think. So to say, I think it can be done. We have some experiences of doing it. I personally prefer the household approach, but it can be done.
Yeah, there's several aspects of it, of course. The actual questions that how they're asked over the phone versus face to face, the interviewer and respondent rapport is another issue. And then, of course, CATI is a medium with which you interview people, but CATI has different characteristics to it when it comes to the actual sampling. If you're doing a random digit dialing survey, CATI is a different thing, and the data is a different thing. If you're doing CATI as a result of a representative household sample, for instance, as we do in Mix Plus and the World Bank high frequency surveys, that's another issue, of course. So there's variability. One last question, Daniel. Why the age group 9 to 17?
Right. Why the age group 9 to 17? And thanks, Attila, by the way, for the expanding on my response. It's I think you're probably more of an expert than I am on the CATI interviewing. 9 to 17. Yeah, we get that question a lot. The only good reason I can come up with is that serving children under the age of 9 or so tends to be a little bit difficult, both in terms of conveying what it is that you actually are asking about, but also just having them sit still, focus on the interview, respond to questions. It's just different. 9 is not. I wouldn't say 9 is a hard limit. Children can be more or less mature, focused, etc. 7, 10, etc. It's just we had to find some kind of a cutoff, and we had some experiences trying to do it with children below the age of 9. It was more difficult. 17, of course, is at 18, not children, and so that's why we went with that cutoff. But there's nothing to say you couldn't try to do it with younger ones. But then going back to Bo's question, at that point you might want to consider if you need different questions, different questionnaires for the very young children. There are other methodologies that have been tried with children, I think, between 4 and 7. But it's not something that we have done.
Thanks, Daniel. Lauren is asking whether you ask questions about the time spent online, and can you speak to the cognitive burden for child respondents or responding to some of the questions?
Absolutely. So on time spent online, yes, it is included in the Global Kids Online questionnaire. We stopped using it in many surveys because it's getting increasingly difficult for anyone really to say when they are online and when they're not. If I'm out eating lunch in a restaurant, but I'm checking my phone, technically I'm online. If a child has their phone in their pocket and they're reachable on WhatsApp and they will, respond to a WhatsApp message immediately when it comes in, are they online or not? So time spent online, we felt, has, in a way, it's lost its meaning unless we try to be more precise about what they spend time on. I think you could ask how much time do you spend playing computer games? How much time do you spend online studying? But time in and of itself is very hard today when everyone is connected through mobile phones. And in most countries, especially non-Western contexts, not even now in non-Western contexts, it's actually changed over the past decade. Mobile phones are by far the most widely used device by children to connect. So what does that mean for this idea of time spent online? So we ask about it, but actually I probably wouldn't recommend it. I think we need a different way to assess impact on children. Cognitive burden is a good question. Can I speak to it? I would say not with great confidence. We haven't kind of formally evaluated how this works other than through the regular pilots that we would do. So I can't speak to whether specific questions are more or less difficult to respond to. We can see in some of our data that some questions tend to produce data that just kind of looks a bit strange, very high rates of non-response, whether that's a consequence of high cognitive burden or just sensitivity, or I don't know. I don't have a great answer to this one, and maybe that suggests that we should find ways to actually assess this somehow prior to rolling out service. I don't know, Attila, if you have good experiences with this, and if there are good ways to do this that I don't know about.
There might be ways, I would think. We don't have experience with it, I would say.
It's a good
an interesting question, interesting and valuable question.
Yeah.
Well, we are about 5 minutes away, so I will pass the mic to Archana to wrap up. But before I do, thank you so much, Daniel, for this, and it was really I personally felt a really good experience with hearing about the data collection, the core data collection aspects of this, which was really great. I think the Kids Online survey and the work that you're doing is extremely valuable and unique, because most household survey programs or household surveys do not actually engage directly with children. So it's very unique and valuable, and you have enormous experience in this. So thank you so much, both for the webinar and for the great work that you have been doing on this. And thank you very much to all the participants for asking great questions, and there were really great questions today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attila, for having me. And yes, thanks for all the questions. They were really interesting. I really enjoyed that.
I'd also like to echo Attila. Thank you, Danielle, and the participants for the great questions. Obviously, Danielle, great presentation. I just wanted to remind everyone that the next webinar will be in 2 weeks, June 1st, and the topic is going to be adolescent mental health. So I hope you can join us for that. Just also a reminder that presentations and recording will be available on our SharePoint site, and the recording of the presentation will also be on the Mix YouTube channel. So give us a few hours or a day or so to get that up and running, but we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.